Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am super excited to talk to Jill Yonit Goldberg about After We Drowned, her incredible novel that takes place in Louisiana in the 80s.
Oh, see.
Um, but before we get started, I'll just ask everybody just to mute their microphones just while we talk. But before we get started, I am going to uh, sorry, windows are popping up. I am just going to share an acknowledgement of land. Junction Reads exists in Toronto, which is covered under Treaty 13 of the Williams Treaties. It is the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wyandot, and the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas and Mississaugas of the Credit. Jill is joining us from Vancouver Island, which is located on the unceded traditional Coast Salish territories. As settlers and newcomers, we acknowledge and accept our responsibility to care for the land and its resources, while also recognizing the continued displacement and colonization of First Nations peoples across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work in the community on their territory. We also recognize our responsibility as treaty people to meaningfully engage in the continuous process of truth and reconciliation. As artists, specifically, we urge the Canada Council for the Arts to further their initial response to call number 83 and increase their funding to projects and works that contribute to the reconciliation process. We also ask anyone joining us here today to support the work of Indigenous writers and artists by purchasing their books and asking your local library to expand their catalogs to include a wider range of books by Indigenous artists. Thank you so much. And Jill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. Yeah.
I am so excited to talk to you about After We Drowned. But before we dive in, I was hoping that you could tell us what you're reading right now.
Okay, I'm doing a little bit of a two-hander right now. So I am reading, it's Isabel Allende's latest book. It's The Wind Knows My Name. And it's been decades since I've read Isabel Allende, but I think I would say she was probably one of the writers who made me fall in love with reading. But this is the first time I'm reading her, maybe in, I don't know, 20 years, maybe. So
Wow.
coming back to her a little bit. And so I have a book for the bus and a book for bedtime right now. And the other one is actually something I'm reading on my Kindle, and it's in French, which means I'm reading it slowly, I should say. So I'm reading La Guerre. It's by Marguerite Duras, and it's her memoir of her time during the French Resistance during the Second World War. So
Wow.
returning to some oldies.
And is that the bedtime book?
The bedtime book is Isabel Allende.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's the
That's
bedtime one.
I was going to say if reading slowly in French is the bedtime book, it
Oh no.
wouldn't go very well for
That's
me.
yeah. That's the on the bus on the way to work book.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Kaylee's going to share links to those two books in the chat for anybody who's
Okay.
interested.
Yeah.
I am excited to find out what section of After We Drowned you are going to read from,
Yep.
but I'm going to share your biography first with
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah.
Jill Yonit Goldberg is a prairie-born former Montrealer now living in Vancouver, where she writes and teaches creative writing at Langara College. Co-author of The Fire Still Burns, Life in and After Residential School, which received an honorable mention in the BC Lieutenant Governor's Awards for Historical Writing and was a finalist for a BC Yukon Book Prize. Other publications, including a smidge of poetry, can be found in the Globe and Mail, Subterrane, Room Magazine, The London Reader, and others. Jill also wrote a short film, Homeland, which went to film festivals across North America and Europe. After We Drowned, which was recently published by Anvil Press, was the third place finalist in the Masters Review Novel Excerpt Contest and also a semifinalist for Autumn House Press's full-length fiction prize. Shortlisted for Yes Yes Books Open Reading Period and was longlisted for the Disquiet Literary Contest. You can find out more about Jill at www.jygoldberg.com. Jill, the floor is
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that introduction and for having me here today. I'm really grateful to Junction Reads for inviting me, but also to everyone who showed up. That's so lovely to see all of you and some familiar faces. And thank you for coming, especially on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening. So I'm going to read a section from After We Drowned, which is one of my favorites. It's actually a part of the section that was third place in that excerpt contest. I don't think you need to know too much to follow along, except that the protagonist here and the narrator is Jesse. He's 15 years old. He's got a younger sister, Willow Rose. They're fleeing. They're fleeing their home. The antagonist, Antoine, has just been, oh, I don't want to give too much away, but he's just been shot. Um, so I'm going to start with that. They're about to head out on the road from their home in Louisiana. Daddy says we have to leave. He says if we don't leave now, we could get in real trouble. When I say that me and Willow Rose have got to go to school, he says, fuck school. And like some demons got him, he tosses things, clothes, blankets, some old flashlight, and all the money he's got into Mama's car. And he tells us to hurry our asses. While we scurry around like each of us is our own human tornado, Daddy dumps water onto the kitchen floor, scrubs it, and then bundles all the bloody towels into the trunk of the car. Mama tells him he's gone crazy, that she doesn't want to go anywhere, but he says that staying here in this goddamn swamp all this time was what was crazy, and now it's time to go. He says he ain't leaving without us. He yells at Mama to set the chickens free from their coop. He tells her it's better this way. Her face twists in sadness and anger, but he's fiery and she gives in. I follow Mama outside into the darkness and watch her spread food out on the ground for them. The hens. She pats them, gentle, scared, and whispers goodbye to them, holding each one to her in turn. They're confused and go right back into their coop, so Mama leaves them there, the coop open, and she turns her back on them with her hand on her heart. Finally, we all settle into the Chevy, me in front, Willow Rose and Mama in the back. When no one is looking, I tuck Farewell to Arms and Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance under the front passenger seat. I keep the binoculars with me. Mama clutches Fortune tight against her body. The last thing I see as we drive away is Antoine's truck and the alligator, a dark shape dangling in the night. When we reach the highway, Daddy stops on the side of the bayou, wraps the bloody towels around stones and let them sink into the water. For the first time in my life, we are going somewhere. At first, the highway unwinds with familiar names, Raceland, Homa, and all the way to Lafayette. We leave behind the bayou and its smell, and I wonder if I'll ever see pelicans dive bomb into the water again, if I'll ever see our crumbling house and the big trees that surround it. Maybe together we'll find our next real good thing. Daddy stops at a gas station and buys a great big map. He says we'll keep going until there's nowhere left to go. I trace my finger over lines and more lines that lead to places I never thought I'd see. Texas, Arizona, California, and then nothing but ocean. Maybe if we travel far enough, I'll forget about Mardi Gras and Lisette, Antoine's face and the smell of the bayou. Maybe we'll end up somewhere good. Hours later, dawn cracks the sky open. We cross a muddy river and a roadside sign welcomes us to Texas. We are somewhere, and it's like nowhere I've ever been. From the back seat, Willow Rose stifles sobs. Mama tries to quiet her, but finally she lets out a real cry. What are you crying about? Mama asks. Willow Rose keeps sobbing. Are you crying about that man? Mama looks at Willow Rose in the rearview mirror, eyebrows raised. Willow Rose nods, her legs folded up to her chest. What if he dies? She asks. He's not dying, Mama answers. But what if he does? Willow Rose asks. You think he was worried about us when he came into our house? Willow Rose sucks in a big breath, making herself hiccup. Will we ever be able to go home? She asks. We are home. We're together, my father says. And even Mama looks at him surprised as he reaches back and touches Willow Rose's knee. I don't know if anyone else thinks it, but I know it's my fault and not Willow Rose's that Antoine came over and that we had to leave. I stay silent and look out the window of the car. Before we reach Houston, I trade places with Willow Rose and offer to hold Fortune. Mama hands him to me and curls up for a rest. Since he's been born, I've hardly spent time with Fortune. Mama's always got him in her arms, always got him in her arms, and he's always suckling at her breast. They're a unit with no need for anyone else, but now that I'm holding him in our warm car, I notice his eyelashes have grown in and his hands have gotten chubby along with his cheeks. I tickle his arm and he smiles at me, putting his hand on my mouth. I nuzzle him with my nose and say, "We're going on a road trip, little brother." He smiles and makes a squealing noise, drooling on me. I grow sleepy with his warm skin stuck to mine. We enter Houston, a web of highways. Daddy cusses at all the other drivers, leans into his horns, and cuts into lanes. Me and Willow Rose peer through the binoculars and call out license plates from other states. I spy one from New York. Willow Rose says she sees one from Washington. Daddy tells us to shut up and let him drive. Outside of Houston, the sky is bigger than any I've ever seen. It's so clear and blue. It makes me think of truth, of bad feelings dissolving into air that's thin and crisp, not heavy like the swamp air I know. We blow through San Antonio hungry and hot, and the desert is all around us. Billboards on the side of the road advertise guns and Jesus, and when we pass a giant sign with cowboys on it advertising a real Texan steakhouse, Daddy announces, "We'll go there." The restaurant is off the highway, and it's huge like everything in Texas, and it has a giant statue of a steer outside. I think my father's lost his mind. We've never sat at a fancy restaurant like this with checkered tablecloths and real waiters wearing cowboy hats, but my father has a plan. When the waiter comes, my father orders the 72-ounce steak challenge. Our waiter, who's not much older than me and has a thin mustache, rubs his hands together. He tells my father that he will have 1 hour to eat the steak, plus the shrimp cocktail, baked potato, and a dinner roll. And if he doesn't manage to eat it all without vomiting, he'll have to pay $72 for his dinner. Daddy chuckles. Like, Daddy chuckles and talks like he's a Texan. "Bring it on, partner," he says. Mama tells him he shouldn't, that we don't have that kind of money, but my father says, "Don't worry, darling," and elbows me and Willow Rose like we're in on the joke. "Well, giddy up," Mama mutters. When our food comes along with a bucket, in case my father needs it, the rest of us ignore our burgers so we can watch Daddy. The waiter asks him to cut one piece of meat and eat it to make sure it's cooked right. So my father cuts a piece so big it fills his whole mouth. He chews, and his Adam's apple bobs as he finally swallows the whole thing down with a swig of Coke and gives the thumbs up. A giant digital clock on the wall is set. My father cuts and chews like he's a dying man trying to get it all in before he keels over. At first, the steak won't shrink. It looks like a whole cow laid itself down on his plate, but my father stays focused. He saws through it and devours the meat, not slowing until he's more than halfway done. He chokes a little. "Emmett, stop," my mama says, and pushes his water glass in front of him. "I ain't paying $72 for dinner," he says, and goes back to stuffing his face. My own stomach starts to ache as my father eats like a beast, lips glossy with fat, not stopping to pick the pieces from his teeth. After my father downs a glass of water, he gulps like he's trying to keep his food down. And making a face, Mama picks up Fortune and goes for a walk. She says she won't watch anymore. Willow Rose begins to chant, "Go, Daddy, go." I have to pee, but I don't want to miss anything, so I squirm in my seat and join Willow Rose's cheer. Each time my father opens up his mouth to shove more food into it, I think of a lion tearing into flesh. Finally, my father swallows the last bite of meat. Willow Rose cheers and my father belches. I cringe, my stomach twisting in disgust. Willow Rose picks up the bucket, but my father shakes his head as he slurps back the shrimp cocktail before demolishing the baked potato. Bits of it fall down his shirt, and my father doesn't notice. Time ticks by fast, so my father stuffs the entire roll into his mouth at once, barely chewing it, crumbs clinging to his greasy lips. With 2 minutes left before the timer goes, my father finishes. He stands, raises his arms like he has just won an Olympic medal, and calls out, "I win!" The waiter comes over and slaps him on the back, and all the other customers look up from their meals and applaud. My father's face is so alive. He smiles and jokes with the waiter. He acts like he's real famous. And when Mama comes back, he gives her and Fortune each a big kiss in front of everybody, like he just became president of the United States or something. Mama squirms away and wipes the grease from her cheek. The restaurant is full of families, but none of the other fathers are acting like mine. I take Fortune from Mama and hide my face in his little neck. Then I slip off to the washroom. When I come back, Willow Rose is high-fiving my father, and a crowd of waiters gathers around. They give him a mug in the shape of a cowboy boot, a certificate, and a t-shirt that says, I survived the 72-ounce steak challenge. They promise his name will be added to their steak challenge wall of fame. Willow Rose tells me that someday she's going to be the first girl to get her name on that wall. Daddy's face has begun to sweat, and he rubs the side of his head as he collects his loot. He tells us he needs some air. At the far end of the parking lot, my father tells us to look away. He turns his back to us and he pukes everything, steak and shrimp and potato. It runs down his chin and onto his shirt. He keeps on heaving long after there's nothing left, until he wipes his face with the back of his hand and then rubs his hands on his jeans and leans on the car, panting. Mama holds Fortune tight to her and says, Oh, Emmett. And then, what a waste. She rubs my father's shoulder with one hand, and he can only nod and hang his head while Willow Rose trots back inside and returns with a pile of paper towels. Daddy tries to wipe his shirt off, but I tell him it stinks real bad, so he throws it in the trash bin and puts on his new one. At least I didn't pay for this, he says, smoothing the shirt with its shiny decal over his chest. Yeah, I say, at least. Thank
Thank
you so
you
much.
so much. I'm so glad that you read that section. I'm smiling throughout the whole thing, but also I'm looking at Laura at the top, also smiling and reacting to the whole thing, which just made it thoroughly enjoyable.
Thank you.
I want to talk about Jesse as a character.
Mm.
There are sections from Emmett's point of view, but Jesse is the real witness in the novel. And it's as a result of him that we end up getting these like super emotional and deep sensual details. I want to talk that excerpt exemplifies that for sure. I want to talk about that, how you created the visual and emotional depth reached with having this narrator that's so close, just watching so close, like not just narrating, but Jesse as a character is just like
Right.
constantly looking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've said it before that I think there's a lot of me in Jesse and also Willow Rose.
Yeah.
But Jesse, his his ability to watch things closely and notice things, isn't that what we all are as writers, right?
Mhm.
Looking and watching and taking it all in. And I sometimes I think writers are kind of the secretaries of the world, right? We see and we hear everything and notice it and think about it and analyze it. So I think there's a lot of me in Jesse and his observations, whether it's about his family members or about nature, his love of things like birds and those cats that he looks after, those feral cats.
Mhm.
There's a lot of me in that. Some of my strongest memories of being a kid and then a teenager are definitely being really taken by art and by nature. And so Jesse came easily in that sense, in
Mhm.
that those qualities that you describe, they're probably some of mine.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's probably just as you say that now, it's probably why I love him so much because he really does. He gives us everything that we want emotionally in that scene. Just thinking
Mm,
about the scene where um, Willow Rose is a firecracker. I'm going to talk about her in a minute, but the scene where Willow Rose kills um, an animal, like that was just one of the most emotional scenes ever. And another scene coming up after
yeah.
the restaurant scene,
Yeah.
it's again such an incredibly visually stark and beautiful thing. And
Mm.
it's thanks to Jesse and thanks to you, I guess. So we have all these characters in the novel. We've just left in that scene that you read, we've just left Antoine, who is a dirtbag in this novel, but also kind of complicated. Like at one point, I actually thought maybe he's not that bad of a guy after
Right.
all.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like that in the best novels, right? Like you can't just say these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. Almost every character in the novel is a bit of both. And I think that's what stands out for me in After We Drowned is almost every single character is messed up, right? Messed up, complicated. There's a promise that they're not going to do the right thing. There's a promise that they're going to complicate things more than they need to be complicated, which of course gives us the best writing. So I want to talk to you about that, about writing these characters, creating these characters.
That's such an interesting observation because when I think of these characters, I think of them with so much love, actually. And I'm so glad you noticed that Antoine, although as you say, he's a dirtbag, he has some really good qualities, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He can be generous and he's funny, and he does step in places where, for example, Emmett abandons Jesse. And so I'm glad you identified that complication. And I think, isn't that just the human condition? I think we all would like to think about characters as being, or people as being one thing only. This one's good, that one's bad. But most people I know are so multifaceted, so layered,
Mhm.
right? And plus, there's no drama if people do the right things.
Right.
There's nothing to write about if everyone makes good choices and is always sensible and reacts to things as they should. So especially Emmett reacts to things badly, doesn't handle
Mhm.
things as well as maybe he ought to, considering he's the parent in this situation. But it's really certainly the thing that I wanted to show is that all of these characters have parts of them that are very good and very smart, right? I think of all of these characters, including Emmett, who's so messed up. He's so smart and he's funny, and I really like the guy.
Yeah.
Um, and Jesse is conflicted, isn't he? I think, where he's kind and he's gentle and he's sensitive, but he really wants to prove that he's a man.
Hmm.
And that sometimes leads him down a path that is violent, where he makes choices that I don't think we could say are good or moral.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think the unspoken thing, or somewhat unspoken in this novel, is that everyone's messed up, or not at all times, but that this oil rig disaster, which obviously is based on the Deepwater Horizon,
Hmm.
that's the catalyst for everything. And how messed up is that,
Yeah.
right? That this really man-made disaster happened, it didn't have to happen, and the trickle-down effects that it had on Emmett and therefore everyone else in his family and so on, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's part of what I wanted to get at too, is that these people who are poor are so much more susceptible to the swirl of traumas just taking them up because of this one big terrible thing that happened. And as a result, just the endless snowball effect.
Hmm. And that's, I mean, the environment is a huge, like a central subject matter in the novel. The oil spill, it's pretty impossible to talk about, to not talk about the environment, although initially I didn't have it as a question when we were first going back and forth. It's it's impossible not to talk about it now with the wildfires
Mm,
going on, but you touched on an important thing that people don't think about. It's easy to attack capitalism. It's easy to attack the motor that is moving this machine that's slowly destroying the planet. But then we have people like Emmett, right? We've got people living in poverty still, even though they
yeah.
are working for fossil
Mm,
fuel companies, oil companies, and these huge capitalistic companies fueling the disasters that are going to destroy us. So I would love for you to talk about that, how these characters, I mean, there weren't even thriving when Emmett had the job. They are the opposite of thriving now that he's lost the now that the oil rig's blown up. But can you talk about that? This how these people exist in this space?
yeah, so much of what drew me to writing this novel or setting it in Louisiana is exactly what you're talking about. And in the reading that I did about this place, I learned so much about how the environment is the thing that presses down on so many people who live there, particularly where Jesse and his family live, which is really southern tip of Louisiana, right on the Gulf of Mexico, which is really the heartland of Cajun culture. And
Mhm.
this is a culture that it's literally being swallowed up by the Gulf of Mexico, where I learned all these things about how a combination of the dredging that they do for these oil wells and the ocean rising is creating a situation where I think it's a football field of land is swallowed up by the Mississippi and by the Gulf of Mexico every 90 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're just losing land, right? By the minute. And
Mhm.
it all has to do with these massive ambitions of big oil. And yet, in a rural place like this, with a lot of poverty and not that many opportunities for education, not that many opportunities for advancement, big oil is the way out. If you can
Yeah.
get a job on one of those rigs, it's one of the few jobs that you can get without a college education where you could advance and you could have a decent living. And so I think Emmett finds himself in that conundrum of, for the first time in his life, he has this reliable job, a reliable source of income. He thinks he can look after his family, but it literally explodes.
Mhm.
And when I visited that southern tip of Louisiana, it was very much the case that people were overcome by the demands of poverty and therefore pushed into this industry, which then attacked the natural environment.
Mhm.
I was there in 2016 and the Deepwater Horizon was 2010. People were still paying for it, right? Where, for example, the shrimp industry, a lot of the shrimp that were coming up still had tumors and three eyes and all of these strange things, or no eyes. And the fish were, had big black spots and tumors all over them. And this isn't just a source of food, it's a source of money for people who live down there. And the Gulf of Mexico itself was still considered unsafe somewhat, and people had cancers and so on and so on. Um, that oil spill, which spilled 3/4 of a billion liters of oil into the Gulf of Mexico.
Mhm.
Um, they used a dispersant which sunk the oil, but the dispersant itself was causing cancers in people and animals, right? So
Wow.
it's just, I mean, we see it in Canada too, right? Where there's extraction, where there's poverty, people are drawn into this industry with high hopes, but it doesn't
Yeah.
always end well.
No, no.
Yeah.
So it's easy to say, and I've said it myself, the joking anytime there's a hurricane, anytime there's something that happens, I will say out loud, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, why do people live there?" But the reality is people live there. People exist
Yeah.
there. They have
Yeah.
lived there. They have existed there for decades,
Right.
generations of people. And
And
so,
Cajun culture, it's such a rich culture, right? It's a very particular, very specific culture that's very tied to that place.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
I don't know if that comes across so much in the book, but it's this place where Cajuns have lived for a long time and their culture, along with the land, is being eroded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to talk about you're talking about the fish and the shrimp. One of the best, there's a lot of them, but one of the best visual scenes is when Emmett and Jesse go fishing, and Emmett is like blindly reaching into this dark water for fish, which for me, I'm like, what are you doing? But he blindly reaches down and ends up with this catfish on his
Yeah.
arm. It was just visually stunning. I could picture it, I could smell it. It was, it was perfect. I loved it.
Thank you. That's a real thing. People do that.
I know. Look it up.
I, I have never done that, but that's the thing. People stick their arms in to get catfish.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I literally looked it up because not because I didn't believe you, but because I thought, I wonder if this is just something Jill saw somebody do and put it in there. But then I looked it up and that's what they do. They
It's a
literally
thing. Yeah,
wade in dark water,
that's right.
reaching down for creatures, which to
Noodling.
me just,
Yeah,
yeah. But
yeah.
I don't go camping because it gets dark and I don't,
Um,
so
and I've been a vegetarian most of my life, so I don't know anything about any of this.
right.
Yeah, thanks, YouTube. Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
Okay. So the novel set, this is going to get light now because
Okay.
of where my brain went while I was reading the book. So
Yeah.
there's a section, the novel set in the 80s. There's a lot of Reaganomics, a lot of stuff for anyone who was living and consciously living, not just born, but consciously living in the 80s. There's a lot of stuff that is um, evocative. But you mention, or one of the characters mentions Fast Times at Ridgemont High. They go and watch it. And I actually did think at one point before this scene that there it was reading like this really dark, gothic John Hughes film, like poor kid, rich girl. And I really actually thought, man, this would be an amazing like 80s gothic movie. But I want to talk to you about the weight of the 80s. There
Mm.
was a lot going on economically, a lot of horrible crap happening politically, but also culturally, there was a lot of great stuff happening. Chapters are titled with excerpts from songs, which I thought was a brilliant choice. But I want to talk to you about how the 80s played in the writing of the novel and the weight or the levity that setting it in the 80s provided.
Right. I never thought of it as a weight. I think I was a kid in the 80s. And so a lot of my cultural references, what is it like to be a kid, come from the 80s, right? My first love was Prince, for sure, when Purple Rain came out. And so I think it was me thinking about myself um, close to that age, I think 80s. So there
Mhm.
was that. The decision to keep it in the 80s had a lot to do with my the demand of the plot that Jesse and his family be very isolated.
Right.
And if there were internet and cell phones, we'd lose that. And I really needed them to be isolated in this place where no one even knew they were there, and to have that experience of physical distance, but also Jesse not being able to just call his girlfriend when they're on their road trip. And
Mm.
so it had to be in a time when no one was on their smartphone all the time. Um, the pop culture part of it, for me, there was a lot of fun in that, right?
Yeah.
There was a lot of fun and just creating that ambiance. The each chapter being named after a song, that was actually surprisingly hard to get that. I wanted so that the novel takes place in 1984 to 85.
Hmm.
And so I wanted every chapter to be named after a song from either 84 or 85. And so I had to look and look at the Billboard Hot 100 from all the weeks of the year that the novel
Yeah.
takes place and try to pick a song for each one. But then I also wanted it to be that in some way the title was reflective of the action of the chapter. So it was a surprising amount of work to do that. Fun.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of work. And I think if we're thinking of the politics too, okay, so now, we're heading into another Trump era. And I think a lot of yeah, sorry. A lot of the a
You
lot
had
of
to
what
bring it up.
yeah, well, a lot of what we see now was originated with Reagan, right?
Yeah.
Even to the point where I didn't know this until reading for this novel, but Reagan's slogan was "Let's make America great again."
Yeah.
So here we are with Trump being, a bigger, more bombastic version of all of that. But for example, of the relevance, after the Deepwater Horizon, the federal government in the US made some changes to safety regulations so that a blowout like that couldn't happen again. Those
Mhm.
regulations were rolled back in 2018 by Donald Trump,
Wow.
right? And so I think there's just a political relevance that uh, is a thread that runs from that era to today.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that idea that, I mean, I wasn't like a thinking intellectual in the 80s.
Nor was
But
I.
yeah, but
Yeah.
the idea that, politically Reagan was the worst, right? George Bush was the
The
worst.
worst. And now
Oh,
it all
the
seems so
worst.
quaint.
Now it's like, Oh, wouldn't it be nice?
So
Reaganomics. He's so
charming.
cute. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
So demure.
yes, so demure, so mindful. Okay, I want to talk about masculinity. You talked about Jesse.
Yeah.
He's coming into his manhood. He does a lot of things that are questionable, as you said. Antoine, questionable. Emmett is questionable
Mm.
in who they are and their contribution to the excuse my language, shitstorm of the world of the novel.
Yeah.
But in that toxic masculinity, I guess, are these female characters. Angeline, despite being a chain smoking pregnant woman, despite being, a demure, speaking of that, a kind of passive, annoying person, I guess, at the beginning, ends up being this incredible. It was almost like a light switch went on for her
Huh.
about three-quarters of the way through the novel. And then Willow Rose, as I mentioned, is this firecracker. And in thinking about who's, you know, as I said in my review of it, like most likely to succeed
Mm.
in a yearbook of all these characters is Willow Rose.
Hmm.
So I want to talk to you about the female voices in this and how satisfying it was, or how um I don't want to overuse the word complicated, but how much work went into developing Angeline as as a complicated woman.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I teach fiction. That's one of the things I teach in my work. And a number of years ago, I taught this one class, and I observed that so many of my students, including the women students, were writing female characters that were passive and nice and weren't doing anything. And around that time, I was also working on the novel, and I thought, oh my gosh, is that Angeline? Um, and I had to work a lot because I think at first I wrote her as more of a, she was nice and she was supportive of Emmett and just more of a good wife and a good mother. And she didn't have some of the qualities of, let's say, leadership or the ability to get angry, the
Hmm.
ability to be sarcastic, or even just being funny at times. So I had to work a lot to make her more gritty and more gravelly. And then I found her a lot more satisfying. And so certainly that was a real thing,
Hmm.
making Angeline have more punch. Willow Rose was born that way
Yeah.
in my mind, I mean.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm glad you observed that because about the women, because I, I definitely was hoping that people would notice that although it's the men who are running around doing this and doing that, that it's the women who are, as they often are, the backbone of strength in this picture.
Hmm.
That when things get difficult, they just get things done
Yeah.
and don't hesitate to do what needs to happen in
Hmm.
order for the plot to advance, hopefully in a better way.
Yeah. I mean,
And I
even.
think that's true of Angeline. Willow Rose is young, but also of Lisette's mother, right?
uh,
She really steps in and saves the day. And even Kathy Almendinger, who's a very, very small character, she's
Mhm.
just getting on with her life in spite of her losses.
Yeah. I
And
loved Lisette's mom.
yeah,
Um, Mrs. Dulac is what's coming into my head, but I know she
yeah,
has a
yeah.
Sally
Salazar Dulac.
Dulac,
Yeah.
yeah, because she gave, and this is going off a bit, she gave empathy in a way that surprised me a little bit, but
Okay.
that is kind of what we expect of people: to be empathetic, to be loving, to be caring, to not just um, you know, toss someone aside because they're poor, because they
Mhm.
don't present a bright future for her daughter. Jesse's certainly not coming across as the, you know,
Right.
Yale graduate lawyer type uh, character that stereotypically a character might want for their kid. So
Yeah.
you did a really great job with her as a character
Thank
too.
you. Yeah.
Early in the novel, Emmett says, I should have died that night. The greater punishment is to live. And that line, it's very early in the novel, lingers right to the very end. And even though there's this like hopeful moment where Jesse looks back and they're, leaving all of the suffering behind, maybe, um, that line is kind of carried right until the end. So that as a reader, I'm closing the book and thinking, it's not going to be that great for them.
Yeah.
I'm hanging on to that pessimism and that negative kind of, stained view of the world. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about negativity and how it truly influences everything from beginning to end in this book.
At the end, there's a corollary to that when Jesse's mother says, dying is easy. It's living that's hard.
Mhm.
And I think that's true, that living, just, I think being a human is hard.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. I think a lot of us, and maybe this is a middle class thing or upper middle class thing, whatever, think that, oh, we're going to arrive at a place in life where there's a kind of homeostasis, where there'll be a nice long period where things are okay, good, right?
Yeah.
We work hard enough, things will be okay. And I think that that equation of you put the work in, the good comes, it doesn't really add up for a lot of people,
Mhm.
no fault of their own, but especially if you are living with poverty,
Mhm.
that equation of you work hard, you do the good things, you put the effort in, it just doesn't always add up.
Mhm.
And that homeostasis, I think, is sometimes just something that's always in the distance. And you keep getting closer and it keeps getting further from you.
Mhm.
There's always a gap between us and maybe what we think of as being stable and easy. And I think that's sometimes true of trauma, where one thing happens and other things follow, right?
Mhm.
Something in the system is destabilized, and then something else is destabilized, and something else is. And it can become a little bit of a snowball effect.
Mhm.
So we see that with Emmett. We don't know who he was before he had the job that much, but why did he start drinking?
Mhm.
We know he grew up in poverty, right? He describes growing up in Shittsville and not finishing school and Angeline getting pregnant young. And so, where did he come from that made him who he is, right?
Mhm.
What are the circumstances that shape him? Not easy ones. It's interesting that you think Willow Rose has the best chance at, making it in the yearbook. Um, because I don't know how hopeful I feel for these characters,
Mhm.
which I feel sad saying. I love them. I love them very much, but hopeful. I'm not sure what'll happen to them. I'm not sure if if it's going to be good or easy. That might
Yeah.
be a fantasy.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it just kind of struck me thinking about Mrs. Salazar Dulac and her empathy. And
Mhm.
just in what you said about that, about this idea of, upper middle class people kind of getting to the point where they've made it, like
Yeah,
I've made it. I've
we're
done
okay now. We've
yeah,
landed.
I've done everything that I need to do. But the reality is there are other people on the planet, right? Like I think if you're living in poverty and you're living paycheck to paycheck, nickel to nickel,
Mhm.
it it's easy. And I think this is why Trump is there, right? Because they deservedly lack empathy, right? They don't have room to empathize
Mhm.
with anyone else in the world. They're just living day to day, trying to pay the bills, trying to, make it till Friday, trying to be alive on Monday morning and that kind of thing. And I sort of feel like that Mrs. Salazar Dulac is a reminder that we need to be empathetic. We need to be more
Mhm.
conscious of not just making it for ourselves, but kind of being aware if we can't help other people make it, but just being aware that other people aren't thriving.
And I hope people notice about her too that she's from Venezuela, right? So she's the immigrant. And she actually says, I don't know if you remember that line where she says, "Oh, such a rich country," about the US, and they can't even teach their children a second language.
Right.
And there's something to that, right? Where she
Yeah.
sees the world in broader terms. She
Yeah.
knows what it's like to be the outsider.
Yeah. I just watched a great documentary about um, gas trading and stuff between Venezuela and Colombia. It was very interesting.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
throw that in there.
I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
just have one more question, and if anyone
Yeah.
has any questions, feel free to throw it in the chat. Kaylee will ask on your behalf. But I am always fascinated with character names, especially because I know Emmett was Michael in an earlier iteration. So I want to talk to
Oh,
you about how Michael became Emmett, how Jesse became Jesse, and how Angeline and Willow Rose became who they are.
right. How do you know that he was Michael?
I found an excerpt.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yes, he was Michael.
I have an addiction to research.
That's
It's a problem.
great.
It's a
Okay, that's so
problem.
interesting digging around the archives.
It's
Um,
that's why it
yeah.
takes me so long to read. Honestly, when people are like,
All the off-ramps.
You still reading that book?" I'm like, "Yes, I've been spending 3 hours looking at catfishing in the bayou. What do you
Oh,
mean
so
reading the
funny.
book?" Yeah.
Yeah, lots of YouTube videos on that. Um, the names, right? So he was indeed Michael, and I thought that I always thought of that as a bit of a placeholder.
Mhm.
I knew I needed something a little sharper, a little edgier, a little more interesting. And so when I really decided to focus, Emmett came to me, which means truth. And of course, that's what haunts him
Right.
is that and I don't think that wasn't exactly what I thought of. It wasn't so literal as that, but thinking of it now, he's haunted by the truth and he's running from the truth, right? And it chases him. He can't lose himself. Jesse, I had a realization not that long ago. I don't know if you read the book Bridge to Terabithia.
Oh,
This
I
is, yeah, I mean, I read that when I was a kid, right? I would
yeah.
have been, I don't know, 10 or something when I read that book.
Hmm.
And I loved that book. And I only remembered recently that the protagonist of that book is Jesse.
Wow.
And that character, that Jesse, stayed with me. He's a beautiful, gentle character. And I didn't think of that until recently, but I wonder if somewhere in the subconscious churn of things, my Jessie is connected to that Jessie. It's also a name I love. It's a little
Yeah.
bit, it's soft and rugged all at once, I find.
Hmm.
Willow Rose, I made up. Fortune, the baby who's born and he experiences misfortune.
Yeah.
But I think that's the name Angeline gives him out of hope
Hmm.
that he'll bring something good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny when I discovered that Emmett was Michael, my first thought was Michael doesn't eat a 72-ounce steak. Like
Right. No,
Em-
Emmett does though.
Emmett eats a 72-ounce steak. Michael
Right.
eats a
Yeah.
72-ounce
And I
steak.
think my placeholder name for Angeline was Elizabeth. And I'm also much happier with Angeline.
Yeah, Angeline's
Yeah.
a name. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I have Fiona. I name very complicated women Fiona. That's my place.
Okay.
I know I have no idea why.
All
And even
complicated
saying it
women are
out
Fiona.
loud, the character from Shrek, only because I know Kaylee went and saw the movie with my kid the other day.
Okay.
That the names like floating around in my head. So I'll be writing something.
Right. Okay.
Thank you so much for
Thank
entertaining
you.
my questions. I
Yeah.
don't know if anyone has any other questions, Kaylee.
Me too. And also, about 20 seconds ago, the fire alarm at my house started going off. So I was like, oh, is this going to be really terrible? And then it just stopped. So
Oh,
everything
Phew.
is working in our favor today. But yes, we have a question from Laura. And Laura says, I know this book took a long road to publication. How do you account for your persistence? What kept you going? Do you have any advice for other writers who are struggling to get their stories out into the world?
Um, what accounts for my persistence? Mental illness? No, I shouldn't say that, but I shouldn't say that, and I don't mean that. But I do sometimes think like, I don't know. I mean, isn't that like, who said that? That the definition of crazy is
The
doing this
definition,
same thing or
getting the
banging
same
your,
result.
what is it?
Yeah.
Thinking you'll get a different response, but doing the
Yeah.
same thing. Um, what accounts for my persistence? Maybe just that there were enough nibbles along the way, right? That occasionally the manuscript placed in a contest or um, after sending it out to, I believe it was 56 agents, I got an agent. Yeah, I have a spreadsheet.
Amazing.
And so there were enough nibbles along the way, enough positive feedback, and I loved the story. Um, I loved it. I felt like only I could, it's mine, right? It's my baby. I created it. And so I had this feeling of, well, I'm the only one who's going to nurture this into existence. So I guess I better do it.
Mhm.
What else is there that's as meaningful as that? And advice, persist. Yeah, keep writing and persist and develop a thick skin.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So
True.
many rejections along the way. And, I remember the early rejections making me cry. And then the rejections now I just shrug off. And it's because they're balanced with enough other things in part, but it's also the feeling of that's the opinion of one person.
Mhm.
So persisting and being able to develop a little bit of a thick skin, having friends to talk to about these things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I look at rejection, and there's a great podcast, Rejected Central. Vince Daldwin runs it. But I look at rejection now. When I get a rejection, I think, okay, great. Now, now I can
Move
send
on.
it. Now I can send it to the literary journal where it belongs, right? Like it's like
Right. A
idea
whittling
now.
process.
Yeah, where it's like, okay, well, you were the wrong place for this story. So now I'm gonna send it to the right place.
Yeah.
And then,
Going where it's warm, right?
mhm,
Finding the place that will love it the way you do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And doing writing prompt summers with
Mm,
other writer friends. I
with
got
Laura.
so for anyone watching who doesn't know, Laura Nickel runs this fun writing prompt thing. If you're a writer and you want in on this, let me know, because it's a lot of fun. I got great
Right.
stories out of that summer writing.
And playfulness like that too, it keeps the whole thing going, right? Because you have
Yes.
this massive project, like the albatross around your neck, the novel that needs to get out there. But if you do other things along the way that are more playful and more fun and expose yourself to other writers and their process, it lightens the load as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's nothing better than waking up in the morning, and I do this with the news too. Like one of the first things I do in the morning is I read something fictional, something
That's
silly,
nice.
something, and that's, I think, what's great about having a community of writers and sharing work, is
Yeah.
that reading reading someone else's, you know, thoughts kind of grounds you in your own nutty thoughts, right? You're like, okay, that was an absolutely bonkers short story. That means I can
Yeah.
write my absolute weird, dark, bananas story.
Yeah. It makes you feel a lot less alone.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? No, that's it. Thank you so much. I urge everyone to grab a copy of this book. Anvil Press, they do sell them directly from their website. You can go to indiebookstores.ca, find a local indie bookstore near you to grab yourself a copy. It's not super big. It's like, I think it was
256 pages.
Yeah, I think for me, and I'm a slow read. I would describe it as a comfortable 3-day read for everybody.
That's fast.
Yeah, but it's only dog walks break up the day. It's
Got it.
yeah, nothing and
Nice.
my 3-hour catfish dives.
Right.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really do appreciate you sitting down and talking with us today. Thank you to everybody who joined us. I really do appreciate you showing up for this and showing up for Jill.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for coming. It's lovely when your work meets its audience, gets to make friends. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you. We are back in person January 26th at Type Books in the Junction in Toronto with Kate Cayley, Robin Pacific, and
Nicola Winstanley.
Nicola and Stanley. I'm so sorry. I usually write that down, but I didn't. And then we're back here with Gurjinja Basran on February 9th. There's a bunch of First 30, which are the writerly conversations that are going on in between there. So follow us at junctionreads.ca and all of the information is there. That is all. Thank you again, Jill. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Kaylee, for everything that you do. This would not function without them. And that's it.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.